Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 at Broadcasting Scotland. And this evening I am joined by Richard Thomson, the SNP MP for Gordon. Good evening, Gordon. Richard. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing absolutely fine. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Right, we'll start off with our coronavirus update this evening. But first of all, before we go any further, if you wish to take part in tonight's show, you can use a hashtag Scotland at 7 on Twitter, and your tweets will show up on the show this evening. Now, we will now carry on with the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 1,632,940 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,439,792 were confirmed negative. 193,148 have tested positive. There are 773 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. This will be an underestimate of the number of cases. Not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 49 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 6,764. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,383 were in hospital last night, 100 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 1,288,004 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 17,137 have received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures published today show 118,195 patients who have tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 799 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. Now for the ONS update. In England, infections, hospitalisations, deaths started increasing in December 2020. The infection rate and hospital admission rate have decreased in recent weeks. Cases compatible with the new UK variant of the COVID-19 decreased in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The number of deaths involving the coronavirus COVID-19 decreased in the last week in England and Wales, but the total deaths remain above the 5-year average. Despite recent increases, most people do not have antibodies to the COVID-19. This suggests most of the population remains vulnerable to infection. The number of deaths registered in England and Wales in the week ending the 5th of February 2021 was 17,192. Just under half, 7,320, of these deaths were mentioned coronavirus on the death certificate, a decrease from the previous week. However, the total number of deaths registered was 40.8% higher than the 5-year average. The latest national records for Scotland figures will be published tomorrow. And now we're going to move on to our first story. But before we do, again, if you want to join us, follow us on Broadcasting Scotland and use the hashtag Scotland as 7. Now for our first story, which I'm sure will be delightful to many parents out there. The youngest pupils return to the classroom. The majority of primary and secondary school pupils will continue with remote learning until at least mid-March, while children in early learning and childcare and primaries 1 to 3 will return full-time to classrooms from Monday the 22nd of February. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, confirmed that only strictly limited numbers of children and young people will return to the classrooms next week, backed by strengthened school safety, guidance and enhanced testing for staff and senior pupils. Very limited numbers of S4 to S6 pupils who require to complete practical work in order to achieve their SQA certificate will also return from Monday. Pupils currently in classrooms, primary, the children of key workers and those considered vulnerable will retain their places. As part of the move, ministers announced a package of support and safety steps, including a further £40 million to help councils implement safety mitigations aligned with clinical advice, £60 million of additional investment in education recovery, including employing more teachers, classroom support staff and facilities management, twice weekly at-home testing to be offered to people who work in schools, early learning and childcare settings attached to schools and senior phase pupils. Comprehensive testing guidance has been issued to schools and local authorities, and by the start of this week, more than 2,200 schools have received test kits, with deliveries remaining to the deliveries to the remaining schools continuing throughout the rest of this week. The programme will be expanded to standalone childcare settings as soon as possible thereafter. Hi, Richard. Just going to ask you, I mean, this is a kind of good news story. It shows us a bit of a way out of the pandemic. And how well do you think this is going to be welcomed? Obviously, the secondary pupils are going to have to observe the 2 metre distancing. Do you think this is us at the start of the way out?
Well, I sincerely hope so. I think, as you rightly say, it's the first kind of baby steps back to recovery and the sign of normality after the latest lockdown that we've gone into. And I mean, I'm sure I speak for working parents the length and breadth of Scotland that we've loved having the opportunity to be with our wee ones, but home learning is a chore, and I think there can't be a parent in Scotland of school-aged children who doesn't have a renewed appreciation for the work that our schools do. So I am satisfied that the virus is at a state where it's safe for a managed phased return to schools. I think taking it with the primary 1s, 2s and 3s is a good step to go. I'll certainly be looking forward to getting my daughter, who's in that category, able to go back to school, and I'm sure she'll look forward to getting to see her friends. So I think it is just one of those first steps down the road to normality, but we still do have a long way to go. And I think it was the First Minister was very wise today when she said that when we look at the roadmap out of this, we're going to have to make some tough decisions sometimes about what really matters. But I don't think anyone could dispute how much schooling and getting kids to be with their friends and having that external experience and stimulus and learning opportunities, I don't think anyone could dispute how important that is. And I'm glad that we're now at a stage where we can start to get back down that road again.
I know it's greatly welcomed. I know with parents that I speak to, they are delighted to see this, and then the next phase is going to be on the 2nd of March, which is great, and which is where my son will hopefully be returning to school. And as you say, the parents probably now have a new insight into the education system and what the teachers do. For our kids in schools. Do you see this maybe kind of providing a more kind of work? I mean, I know in schools they have a fantastic working relationship with parents, but this may slightly change again and be involving children and parents more to get more involved with kids in the education with schools and things. Do you think this is maybe a wee step in the kind of another direction of how we educate our children?
I would hope so. I mean, I would hope that it would cause us to have a pause for reflection on a few fronts. First of all, about what education is, that it's not always about sitting in front of a blackboard. Also about how education can be supported at home, but it also brings to some of the problems that there have been about particularly vulnerable children who their visibility decreases, and sometimes, sorry to say, school is the most stable part of their day. Not everybody is going to school, fully fed, coming from a fully loving, engaged background. So I know that an awful lot of teachers have been very, very worried about some of the children that they teach, simply because they're not getting to see them every day like they do in term time. So I think we need to think in the round about that. But one other interesting aspect of it, and particularly challenging aspect that's been thrown into sharp relief, is the gap between the digital haves and have-nots. Do you have a good broadband connection, for example, that's reliable enough to do video learning and to download the resources? Do you have a device that you can access that on? Can you afford to pay for the data if that's metered? Do you have all of these three things together? Now, I know in Aberdeenshire, where I'm speaking from just now, the council has done its very best to get devices out to families that didn't have suitable devices. It's paid for data dongles, but you need all three things there. You need the device, you need the access, and you need the skills as well. So it's thrown that into relief. And just as a wee aside, one of the all-party parliamentary groups that I'm involved in down at Westminster is the friendship group with Estonia, because I think it's really interesting to get those insights from another small European country. And Estonia is generally regarded as one of the most progressive go-ahead countries when it comes both to education as well as digital connectivity. But even there, they've been having exactly the same problems about a vulnerable cohort of kids that just their visibility almost goes. And again, same problems about getting people that last mile of connection that we have here. So the problems that we have are pretty common right across Europe, but I hope it does bring that new sort of reflection on it. And as well, again, exams, we saw what happened with exams last year. One of the things I would hope comes out of this is maybe realising that exams don't have to be the be-all and end-all, and the elements of continual assessment and teacher assessment and estimates and things like that can actually give a more rounded view of somebody's abilities and how they've performed and how they've learned and what their potential is. And I think that's something that we need to consider very carefully going forward, that the mad dash for exam results is not necessarily a very good measure of how capable somebody is or what their potential is.
Definitely. There's so much more to education than what our exam results are at the end of the day, and there's so much, there's kids have got so much potential.
Well, exactly.
Thank you very much, Richard. We're going to move on to the next
it.
story now, which is about non-domestic rates. Relief is being extended. Retail, tourism, hospitality and aviation businesses will pay no rates during 2021 to 2022 under proposals outlined today. It is one of a series of measures proposed by Finance Secretary Kate Forbes following confirmation of a further £1.1 billion of consequential funding arising for the UK government coronavirus COVID-19 spending. The move builds on 3-month rates relief extension announced in the Scottish budget and will be taken forward to provided the Scottish Government receives the funding already assumed from the UK budget on the 3rd of March, and that requisite funds are available to maintain existing support into 2021 to 2022. Newspapers will also continue to benefit from this 100% relief for a further 12 months, where charitable rates relief will not be removed from mainstream independent schools until the 1st of April 2022, during the ongoing impact of the pandemic. Other extra spending in 2021 to 2022 arising from the latest consequentials includes £20 million for mental health, 120 million, my apologies, it's £120 million for mental health, £120 million for affordable housing, £100 million to support people on low incomes, £60 million for schools to help pupils catch up on missed education, and £60 million for NHS recovery, and £45 million for the heat, decarbonisation, energy efficiency and fuel poverty, £21.5 million for Scottish Enterprise separately, Local authorities will receive an extra £275 million in the current financial year to address COVID-19 pressures, while a further £40 million will be made available to support the safe reopening of schools. Again, Richard, based on if we get this money from the UK government, this is going to be very beneficial to the recovery of Scotland in terms of the businesses, classrooms, mental health, NHS. There's a wide scope here. How confident of you are you that we are going to receive this money from the UK government and we're going to be able to spend this wisely?
Well,
Obviously, the Scottish Government are going to spend it wisely.
Well, I was about to say I've got no doubts on that front, and I think in terms of getting it, now it's being announced there will be hell to pay if it doesn't come through the system. Look, I've been advocating for months and months that obviously we knew that the 1 year of zero rating non-domestic or business rates, that was an absolute lifeline for businesses that had to shut, like in the hospitality sector, aviation and leisure and retail, that if you weren't able to get the same numbers of people through taking part and putting their money over the counter, then you needed to do everything you could to strip out the fixed costs that were there for these businesses. Business rates were one of the key costs that you could take out of that equation, and it was right to do it. But it was obvious there was an end date to that, and that at that end date, that was a cliff edge unless we were able to keep going. So Kate Forbes said, well, we can afford to do it for another 3 months, and if the UK government comes forward with additional money, we'll extend it for as far as we can. We've now got enough in there that we security about that to know you can go for the next 12 months. And that, I think, will come as a huge relief in retail, leisure, hospitality businesses, that will help them trade their way through the next few months and back to what we hope is some kind of normality as hopefully we get on top of the virus and the vaccine does what it needs to do. But the one thing I would say is this is not, as some people would have you believe, a sign of the strength of the union or the success or the generosity of the UK government. They're only giving us our money back, and money that they have effectively borrowed on our behalf, because the Scottish government has no meaningful borrowing powers. It cannot borrow to invest. It cannot borrow to meet shortfalls in revenue like any other normal government at just about any tier of government that you care to mention. Throughout, the response to coronavirus in Scotland, I think, has been inhibited by the fact that the Scottish Government lacks those basic financial powers. You can see what the problem is in Scotland, you can decide what you want to do about it, but until the government, which is effectively the government for England, remember, in this regard, comes to the same conclusion, decides to spend money and then triggers the Barnett consequentials, effectively the Scottish Government is whistling because it doesn't have the ability to marshal that resource. That's a key argument for independence. You're able to decide what you want, what your government wants to do, and the government can marshal the resources at its disposal in order to match those resources up with the policy that's needed. That's the key benefit of independence. And if there's one thing that we've learned out of the pandemic, it's that the devolution settlement has so many creaks and flaws in it that cannot be overcome, even with goodwill from Westminster towards Scotland, which often at this point is politicised out of existence. So for me, this just reinforces the argument that we're better off in charge of our own affairs, better off in charge of our own resources, because that puts you fully in charge of policies. So announcement today, very welcome. Yes, I'm sure the money will come through, but wouldn't it have been an awful lot better if Kate Forbes had the facility to say 6 months ago, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to pay for it? I think so. That's why I want independence.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, it would have made a big difference if we had that announcement a long time ago. But however, we will move now on to the next story. The IFS says Sunak must extend furlough to make £20 universal credit uplift permanent. The Chancellor is under mounting pressure to ditch plans to shut down the furlough scheme prematurely and to use the upcoming budget to extend support and make the £20 uplift to universal credit permanent. Ahead of the budget next month, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, IFS, has urged Rishi Sunak to recognise and address the multiple inequalities exacerbated by the crisis, and said that the emergency support should be extended and that the furlough scheme should not be cut completely in one go. The IFS also said that there is no such need to phase out a £20 a week increase in universal credit, adding that given that basic support for the childless unemployed has not risen in 50 years as earnings have more than doubled, and as much as less generous than many comparable countries, there is a case for maintaining this increase. Just reading that there now, Richard, that's absolutely shocking. It's not raised in 50 years. And then this £20 they're threatening to take away. Do you think Sunak is going to take the advice and keep the £20, and possibly what is needed, and we need to be seen as that to be passed on to the legacy benefits as well. Do you think there's any chance that Sunak is going to do this at the budget, keep the £20 and also possibly extend it to the legacy benefits?
Well, I sincerely hope he does, and I think there is a bit of a debate going on behind the scenes in the Conservative government at Westminster about what to do. I mean, I asked questions for the women inequalities questions last week about whether or not this would be kept, and I got a pretty slippery, evasive answer from the minister. It was not a confident yes, but equally it wasn't quite a no. And I think, to be honest, it's absolutely the least that the government can do. We've seen the gap widen between the most well-off in society and the least well-off over decades. And quite frankly, £20 is to people on benefits, to give them an uplift on universal credit or legacy benefits, is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively minor. But the difference that makes to those who are in receipt of that benefit is enormous. You know, it's the difference between knowing that your bills are paid or having that relative security and not, compared to what you had before and not. And frankly, it's good for the economy to put that money into to uplift benefits in that way, because this is money that is going to get spent. It's going to get spent on essentials like keeping people warm and healthy, keeping families clothed and well fed. That's going back into the economy and it's being recycled. It's keeping people in work. If you give money to those who need it most, they will spend it in a way which is productive for the economy. If you fritter it away in tax breaks for the very, very wealthiest, it's going to end up in schemes where it doesn't get picked up again in the tax system. It's going to be saved, or it's going to be offshored, or whatever it is. Quite frankly, I think we need to. I would much rather we had a universal basic income. I've been arguing for that along with colleagues in the SNP and beyond since before the start of this crisis, because that way everybody who needs something is assured of getting the financial support that they need to put food on the table and keep their homes warm and keep a roof over their head. But so I think it's absolutely the least they can do is to keep that £20, because in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the deficit that is there at present for the UK government, it's pretty making a minimal contribution towards it, and it makes such a difference to those who need it most. In terms of the furlough, I think there needs to be a targeted use of the furlough, because you can't just take it all away. It needs to be done on a sector by sector basis. But again, there's so many people have slipped through the net, nearly 3 million people who were either remunerated as directors through dividends, not always directors of their own small businesses. Some of the newly self-employed have missed out. You know, there are too many people who have been excluded from that. And if we'd just paid everybody a universal basic income, it would have been so much better. We would have made sure that the resource got through to everyone who needed it, and we could have taxed it back from those who were fortunate enough to not be in a position to need it. So I think it's time for a root and branch reform of how we look at benefits and make sure that we're actually getting the resources that we have to those who need them most and who can benefit it most, because in the end it's a benefit for us all for that to be the case.
Thank you, Richard. Universal basic income is something that we talk about quite a lot here in Supporting Broadcasting Scotland, and you're right, it would be just give everybody the basic income just to be able to look after themselves, and it would make life a lot easier. And yeah, economies grow from the bottom up, not not the top down. But we'll move on now to our next story, which is the creative sector completely ignored during the Brexit negotiation. Cross-party MPs have today challenged the UK government over its Brexit zealotry, my teeth are not in tonight, attitude towards abolishing EU visas after hearing that the deal offered by the EU would have worked for the UK creative sector. Speaking at the Digital Culture, Media and Support Committee today, Deborah Annetts, Chief Executive of the Incorporated Society of Musicians, slammed the Tory government for its incompetence during negotiations, believing that musicians and performers were low on their priority list. The UK government have repeatedly claimed that the deal offered by the EU would not have worked, something Mrs Annetts categorically denies. SNP MPs supported creative stars such as Sir Ian McKellen, Julie Walters and Patrick Stewart in calling on the UK government to ensure musicians and performers are on the list of workers permitted to enter the EU without a visa. Richard, as somebody that knows many of the creative industry, I know how this affects them, and once again it's like the creative sector being kind of pushed aside, that it's not really a proper job, it's not a real career, and that's what it seems like. Would you think this is going to do you think the Tory party is going to somehow maybe hopefully come up with some sort of agreement with the EU regarding our creative sector? Because we do get a lot of people even come from the EU over here, especially in Scotland and especially with the Edinburgh Festival as well. Do you think they would maybe push for negotiations and come up with some sort of plan?
Well, I hope wiser counsel might prevail. I mean, there's an awful lot of things have been absolute afterthoughts because of the chaotic way that Brexit was negotiated. And to be honest, let's be honest about this, the Tories spent far more time trying to negotiate amongst their own ranks at Westminster than they did negotiating a deal that might actually be in some ways beneficial or at the very least not harmful to a wide range of sectors and areas of interest. I mean, this to me just seems to be, it illustrates the sheer pointlessness and futility of and the damage that Brexit has caused. I mean, you mentioned the Edinburgh Festival, you look at things like Celtic Connections in Glasgow, and the sheer amount of to and fro and artistic and cultural exchange that there is now. That's not going to die out, obviously, but it makes things an awful lot harder because the tours are being affected aren't going to necessarily be the big bands or the big orchestras necessarily that receive support. It's the smaller artists, the less well-known performers, the folk who are doing it to cover their costs if they can even manage to do that, the folk who are doing it with a real love of it, who've practiced their craft, who've spent years in perfecting their craft, and also everybody else that goes into supporting that, the people who look after the costumes, the people who build the stages, the people who look after the lights and the sound and everything like that. There's a whole pyramid. You maybe have the performer at the top as the most visible person, but below that there's just such an ecosystem of creative, hard-working individuals who are seeing their livelihoods put on the line. It's bad enough that many of them are people who've been excluded from financial support through the coronavirus crisis. But to put additional barriers in their way seems to me to be, I just don't understand how you're enhancing your sovereignty or making yourself feel better by doing that. Because it comes down to things like visas, getting the ability to work, going beyond 90 days. It's even things like making sure you've got carnets for musical instruments because, because governments are looking for assurances that you're not going to take, a clapped out piano across to Europe with you and you go and buy a better one there and then try and import it and claim it's the same one. That might sound trivial, but that's the sort of level of
Yeah.
paperwork and bureaucracy that you're having to get yourself involved in. And the promoters of many festivals are just going to decide that it's no longer worth booking Scottish artists and performers, and sadly vice versa. And it's something that just impoverishes us all. Played the fiddle
Yeah.
for years and years. And I've toured, I've played on cruise ships, I've gone to with school orchestras to North and South America. We've hosted cultural exchanges when I was
Yeah.
younger. And it just feels it's another part of the world that's being closed off to, particularly to younger people. But it's just a narrowing of our horizons, and it just sums up how petty and pathetic the motivation for Brexit has been all through.
Yeah, it's certainly. Right, to move on to the next story now. Monica Lennon, poll open to independence poll. Scottish Labour leadership hopeful Monica Lennon has said support for independence could increase if Labour refuses to accept a fresh referendum may be needed. Lennon, who has the backing of the left of the party, said more voters would desert Labour and back independence if they saw the party lining up with Boris Johnson by refusing to accept the case for a referendum. Anis Sarwar has continued to reject calls to support a new referendum, but Miss Lennon said that the pro-independence parties will have a mandate for a new Indie ref if they win the majority of the Holyrood seats in May's Scottish elections. Now, this is quite interesting, Richard, in the sense that someone from Labour is now actually calling to support another referendum. Now, I know many of independent supporters who are traditionally Labour supporters and Labour voters, and you know, at the moment they're kind of caught. They're not, you know, they want to vote for SNP because they want to go down the independence route, but traditionally they are Labour voters, and I personally would think that would make sense for Labour, especially in Scotland, to start supporting a referendum for Scottish independence. What's your thoughts on this, Richard?
Well, I think, first of all, I welcome the fact that Monica Lennon has recognised the reality that if there is an SNP majority, an independence majority in the Parliament, that you cannot stand in the way of that. But again, I think it sums up what a pretty pass we've come to, where we're looking to give Monica Lennon a round of applause for simply not being against the democratic will of the people, if that is how it's expressed. I mean, I think Labour have found themselves caught in a hook of their own making.
Yeah.
They lost the way that they worked with the Tories during the 2014 referendum. The way that the whole Better Together campaign was constructed more or less guaranteed the results that we've seen electorally since. And the promises filled, and that allied voters who want independence, albeit there's still, you know, a substantial number who are in Labour who will probably never vote anything other than Labour, no matter how much they want independence. That's why having a referendum is important, to unlock that, instead of trying to corral it through the gates at a general election. But they've also lost the hardcore pro-union vote to the Tories. And I think it's a bit like they've almost got another version of that in the north of England, where they lost pro-Brexit voters because they never advocated the benefits of EU membership strongly enough to their voters there. And they lost them to the Tories at the last general election. And I think Labour has ended up, instead of being all things to all people, it's ended up being nothing to anyone. And that's the mess that they're in. Anas Sarwar, I just think, seems to be a more of the same candidate. I think Monica Lennon is to be commended for her honesty and commended for her principle, if nothing else. But I think, like I say, it shows how far Labour have sunk that we're able to say that we're thinking it's somehow out of the ordinary for somebody to recognise that if the Scottish people want something badly enough, then that's exactly what they should get.
Definitely. Right, now to move on to the next story. The lawsuit accuses Trump and Giuliani of conspiring to incite the Capitol riot. A Democratic congressman has accused former President Donald Trump and his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and two right-wing groups of conspiring to incite the deadly riot at the US Capitol in a lawsuit. The civil lawsuit accuses the duo of violating the Ku Klux Klan Act, an 1871 law passed to crack down on white supremacist organisation, and is the latest legal attempt to find Trump responsible for the violence on January the 6th, which came after he spent months of falsely claiming his election defeat in November was the result of widespread fraud. It also names as defendants the Proud Boys, the far-right organisation, and the anti-government militia known as Oath Keepers. The insurrection was the result of a carefully orchestrated plan by Trump and Giuliani and the extremist groups like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, all of whom shared a common goal of employing intimidation, harassment, threats to stop the certification of the Electoral College, according to a press release announcing the lawsuit. The US Senate on Saturday acquitted Trump of inciting the January the 6th riot when 57 senators, including 7 Republicans, voted to convict, short of 67 votes needed. Although most Republicans voted against convicting Trump, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell nevertheless made it clear he felt Trump was responsible, saying there is no question that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of that day. Representative Benny Thompson, a Democrat who chairs the House of the Representatives Homeland Security Committee, is named plaintiff on the suit in US District Court in Washington. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People and attorneys from the law firm Cohen, Miston, Sellers and Toll PLLC are handling the litigation, including the Democratic Representatives Hank Johnson and Bonnie Watson Coleman are expected to join the lawsuit. Now, Richard, once again, another lawsuit going up against Donald Trump, the former president. Do you think this is going to be another one of these? Because we've seen him being acquitted on Saturday, which I was quite shocked at. Do you think this is going to kind of be able to kind of go through the courts, or do you think it's going to be thrown out, or do you think it's just, what's your feelings on this one?
I don't know how this will progress through the legal system. But what I would say, I mean, I was a little bit surprised that they went down the route of impeachment after he was no longer the president. I don't pretend to be a great expert in US politics, but it struck me as a little bit odd that you could impeach a president who was no longer a president. Now, that's for Congress obviously decided that was within its powers, and it decided it was within scope and then did what it did with that. But I think there's a world of difference between what is impeachment, which is essentially a political process, and a judicial process, which this looks like it is. Now, I wasn't aware of the Ku Klux Klan Act, but if it's an act or there's any act which forbids incitement, as there must be, then I would have thought that stood at least some chance, you would imagine, of getting a bit of traction, because incitement is a very, very serious matter indeed. And I think there is a significant amount of evidence that you could point to, both circumstantial and actual, about the way that Mr. Trump fired up his base to fever pitch. I remember one particularly notorious tweet that doesn't narrow it down, but addressing the Proud Boys, telling them so to stand back and stand by. I don't think you can get much more clear cut than that in terms of seeking to incite people. So I think it's quite clear he behaved despicably. He behaved in a manner that was incompatible with the status that he held at the time. And I think given the damage that was caused and the loss of life that there was and the threat that it posed to faithfully discharging the votes of the American people, means that it's absolutely right that he should be pursued to the fullest extent that the law in America permits. Now, in the end, American democracy was robust enough to withstand that challenge, but there is damage that goes on much beyond that in terms of a lack of trust in news and in the public sphere. There's now a radicalised element in US politics, and I can only hope that Joe Biden manages to be the person who can start to, he certainly won't achieve it in one term or even two, but I hope he can start to be the person who brings America together. Some people might say that pursuing Mr. Trump through the courts doesn't assist with that. There have to be consequences for actions, and it's quite clear what he was doing in terms of inciting his base. And I don't think he can reasonably get away with stepping back and saying, well, I didn't intend for that to be the outcome. That is the inevitable outcome of years of rabble-rousing and questioning the integrity and the legitimacy of the system at which he was at the apex. So I'll be interested to see where this goes, and I hope that he is able to be pursued to the fullest possible extent.
One of the things I was wanting to ask you as well, Richard, about this, I was talking to a friend at the weekend about this because we had been watching this live, the impeachment process and everything, and it makes you wonder of how it's going to affect the America on the world stage of politics, in the future. Do you think it's going to affect America on the world stage of politics of the future in terms of their democracy and things and how they've dealt with Trump?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of regimes around the world that will that are able to point to how that election was said to have been conducted, not how it actually was conducted, but how Donald Trump said it was conducted, that will provide a bit of cover for less savoury regimes around the world in terms of how they behave, in terms of how they treat their civic institutions, in terms of legitimacy. It undermines all of that. But fundamentally, the Constitution endured. And I think that the people who really need to examine themselves are those who are the enablers. The Constitution was robust, but there were too many people who allowed themselves to bend with the wind and to go with what was convenient, and there was a banality to all of that it was too easy for some people to stand by and not do the principal thing, and sometimes to say, no, Mr. President, you shan't do that. And so I think that it is rebuildable with the right people in place doing the right things. But there have to be consequences and accountability for what went on. But I think the people who really need to examine their consciences in this aren't, we all knew what Donald Trump was like before he assumed office, but it's those who enabled him along the way, who should have known better, who should have stood up for principles within the Republican Party, and those in the administration who could have put checks and balances in at an earlier stage, and who didn't. That is, I think, what the story that needs to be written and understood as part of this process of bringing people back together and helping America to rediscover how the Constitution and how its governance and politics should be. Yeah,
thank you, Richard. And we'll move on to our next story now, which is the Norway Wealth Fund tells businesses to put more women on their boards. Norway's £1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund, the world's largest, wants the companies to invest in globally to boost the number of women on their boards and to consider setting targets if fewer than 30% of their directors are female. One of the world's largest investors, the fund holds stakes in around 9,200 companies worldwide, owning 1.5% of all listed stocks. It has set the pace on a host of issues in the environmental, social and corporate governance field. Boards where either gender less than 30% representation should consider setting targets for gender diversity and report on progress. And the fund said in a position paper published yesterday, we may phrase it politely, but it is pretty clear what we think, Chief Executive Nikolai Tangen said in an interview. What we want is to see better representation of women on the board, added Kering Smith Incio, the fund's Chief Governance and Compliance Officer. Diversity is good for the board because it brings better perspective, it is better for decision making, and increasingly important for the legitimacy of companies, said Smith in Incio. A lack of female representation might be seen as a red flag that a company does not have a good process to recruit the best director. Now, Richard, a wee bit of gender equality is never a bad thing in any company or business. What do you make of this with Norway going forward with this wee plan regarding gender equality?
I think it's great. I mean, I think globally, I saw a statistic earlier today that about 17% of company boards globally don't have a single woman on them.
Wow.
And that's just absolutely ridiculous. And I think in your introduction to this item there, you hit the nail on the head. If you don't have that gender balance, how can you possibly be saying that you're making the most of the talent that you have that's ready to go onto a board? How can you say you're making the most of the talent within your organisation? What does it say about the culture that you're not bringing enough sufficient numbers of women through who you consider are capable of serving on the boards? And the idea that women are that is a fair representation of talent and ability and experience and perspective just does not wash, and I don't think should be allowed to stand. So I think that the Norwegian fund is, in using its power, is using it very judiciously indeed in terms of helping to promote that behaviour. I mean, obviously I'm tempted to say, isn't it brilliant to have an oil fund like that invested in all these shares and equities that allow you to exert that influence? Obviously it's brilliant for Norway to have that oil fund. If only we'd been able to do the same in Scotland 40 years ago. But nevertheless, they have that power. But also, I think what it shows is the power of shareholder activism. We often consider that we're powerless, and actually we're not, because most of us who've worked, we've invested in pension funds, maybe not very much, but you just think about Scotland's local authorities and the billions of pounds under management there, the amount of money that's under management in our pensions and life assurance sector, and the sheer amount of power that brings at company AGMs to challenge behaviours, to try and change policies and bring about positive change, whether that's in terms of environmental justice, whether it's in terms of social justice, in terms of equalities. Because ultimately, taking cognizance of all these things leads to better decisions and better outcomes for shareholders and profits, most obviously, but for society in general. So I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing that the Norwegian fund is doing to use that investment power to bring about positive change. And much as I would love to have an oil fund of a similar size in Scotland, or any kind of oil fund in Scotland at all, let's not overlook the power that we do have in terms of the investments that we make, because the actions that are taken by these companies, whether we like it or not, are taken in our name. And if we don't like it, then it's incumbent on us and those that we entrust to look after our savings and our retirement savings in that way, to use that voting power at company AGMs for good, and bringing about a more equitable, equitable balance of genders, and making sure that you're bringing the talent through, and making sure that your company is working in the way that it needs to maximise the talent at its disposal, is absolutely the right thing to be doing. Good on them.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing is customers also have that power as well. If they notice a company that's not allowing the talent to come through, they can use their power of where they shop, what services they use. So customers have that power as well. So it would be good for more people to be thinking along that way, forcing these businesses and companies to allow the talent to come through, to allow more gender equality as well, even
Absolutely.
in Scotland.
And as the companies that do start to be regarded as exemplars in that way, it almost pushes their competitors to follow suit. It's one of those things that once it starts, there's a domino effect that's entirely positive. So, like I say, good on the Norwegian Pension Fund for doing this. And I hope that other pension funds and investment houses start to do similar, because in this case, money talks, and that's how one of the ways that we can make the difference.
And it would be good to see something like that happening in Scotland as well. Right, now to move on to our next story. The More Business support is now live. £60 million for newly self-employed, close contact businesses and driving instructors. The two funds to support people whose livelihoods have been affected by the pandemic are now open to applications. Grants will be available for mobile and home-based close contact service businesses, such as makeup artists and hairdressers, as well as registered driving instructors. The newly self-employed hardship fund, which paid out more than £1,100 million in vital support last year, will also reopen for a second round. Both funds will provide £4,000 grants to successful applicants. Full eligibility details are available online. Now, Richard, as someone who's self-employed myself, I know how much these grants are just vital. And I know so many people who are self-employed who will be absolutely, kind of doing a happy dance right now, that they're getting a wee bit more help. What about your experience in your constituency with people who are self-employed, the newly self-employed, and who will be able to take these up? Do you think they'll be doing a wee happy dance as well?
Well, I think they'll be doing a sigh of relief, certainly.
Yes.
And that was one of the problems that we identified early doors with the furlough scheme. I mean, I was there in March when the lockdown happened. Was speaking off the front bench. I was temporarily. I was one of the handful of SNP MPs that were there, and I found myself speaking in these early debates about resourcing and furlough and things like that. And you could almost see the look of horror go across the Chancellor's face when people started asking, but what about the self-employed?
Yes.
And then he came up with this overly complicated scheme, and everyone talks about the Chancellor's forensic attention to detail, and the conclusion I came to a while ago with him was he's got a forensic attention to exactly the wrong sort of detail.
Yeah.
He was so determined to make sure that a few pounds didn't go astray that he ended up shutting out 3 million people from any kind of support at all. So I was delighted when the Scottish Government stepped in with a newly self-employed support scheme a few months ago. Delighted that it's going to continue because the need for that hasn't gone away. In terms of support for close contact, and there's been important sectoral support that's come through, like support for the wedding sector. Because, I mean, look at hospitality and weddings. It's not just it supports all sorts of things. I benefited from that myself as a musician, but, they're supporting the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. And again, it's about
quite literally.
cycle. Exactly. It's the cycle of money in the economy, and it's about also making sure people survive, are able to live, and more importantly, are there and have the confidence to pick up and start doing everything that they do best as soon as circumstances once again allow them to do so. So I'm delighted that this is carrying on. But again, it's unnecessarily last minute. And if only the Scottish Government actually had the powers, we could have set that policy course a long time ago and said we will do genuinely whatever it takes, not just say as Rishi Sunak wants to do whatever is convenient at the time, but we will genuinely do whatever it takes, and we can guarantee you that this support will be there for as long as it needs to be until we can start to remove it again when the economy starts to pick up and people can start to be in close contact once again. So big sighs of relief, but again it comes back to the point. We should have these powers in Scotland already to do this without having to wait for spending decisions in England to take place, which then allow us to do that. And if we're not going to get those powers under any version of devolution, which quite clearly we're not, independence is the answer, and that's what we need.
Definitely, Richard. Now to move on to another good news story. Young people helped with the costs of a new job. The Scottish Government has paid out more than £190,000 to eligible young people to help with the costs of starting a new job. A total of 695 successful applications were made for the new Job Start payment from its launch on the 17th of August 2020 to the 31st of December 2020. The one-off payment of £250 or the higher rate of £400 if the recipient is the main carer of any children is available to 16 to 24-year-olds who have been offered a job after being out of work for at least 6 months and are in the receipt of a qualifying benefit. The Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, Shirley Ann Somerville, said, "From travel costs to buying new work clothes or childcare, we know there can be an expenses involved with starting a job. Our new Job Start payment is designed to support young people with those costs as they move into work. At a time when we know young people are disproportionately impacted by the economic impact of the pandemic, this support will be important more than ever for those who are starting a new job after a period of unemployment. I want to encourage anyone eligible to apply for this extra financial support." Now, Richard, this again another wee good news story here about something that the Scottish Government's doing to allow the young people the cost of starting a new job. As we all know, if starting a new job is quite costly, and especially if you've been unemployed, and it's a transition period going between the unemployment and starting a new job and getting your first wage, as well as the kind of expenses of clothing and things like that. So again, a good news story, and thumbs up for the Scottish Government. And also, what else could we do if we were independent?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think it's a comparatively small amount, but it's something it's a comparatively small amount that can make a world of difference to somebody. I mean, one of the things that's always troubled me is the drop off that there is in terms of your income and your resources when you're coming off benefits and going into work. And it's happened to me as well, coming off a period of unemployment that I went through a few years ago. And, I was fortunate in my own circumstances that I was able to turn up at work and I could withstand the 5 weeks until my wages started to come through. But that's a long time to go without money. And if you've got to buy a bus ticket, your bus tickets, you've got to get yourself suitable clothing to carry out your job. That's all a disincentive to go out to work, and especially if you want to make the best of yourself and get out and get into the world of work again, perhaps even for the first time. We want to be doing everything we can to remove those kinds of obstacles to help people be all that they can be. So small amount of money, big difference, shows the benefits of being in charge of your welfare system and being able to tackle these gaps that the UK system, with the best will in the world, just never seems to recognise and allow people to overcome. Because ultimately the welfare system should be there to help you, to recover, to get back on your feet after losing your job, to help you through whatever misfortunes life throws at you, and to get you back and able to make the best contribution that you can, that you're capable of making. And I think that this is one of the ways that we can help our young people, particularly to find their place in society and to get on with life.
Definitely, Richard. Now for the last story of the evening. Vitamin D take up by the Shielding Group. In November last year, the Scottish Government offered people on the Shielding list a free 4-month supply of vitamin D to support their health and well-being over the winter months. Just over 71,300 people opted in to receive a supply of vitamin D, which was sent to their homes from the week commencing the 23rd of November. The remaining supply will be allocated proportionately among the health boards in Scotland. In January, Food Standards Scotland launched a new campaign to raise awareness of vitamin D and encourage people to take vitamin D supplements to maintain bone and muscle health. Our main source of vitamin D is sunlight, but in Scotland we only get enough of the right kind of sunlight for our bodies to make vitamin D between April and September. Everyone, including children, should consider taking a daily supplement containing 10 milligrams of vitamin D, particularly during the winter months of October to March. It is specifically recommended that groups at higher risk of vitamin D deficiency take a daily supplement all year round. These groups include all pregnant and breastfeeding women, infants and children under the age of 5 years old, people who have low or no exposure to the sun, for example, those who cover their skin for cultural reasons, are housebound, confined to indoors for long periods, or live in an institution. People from minority ethnic groups with dark skin, such as those of African, Caribbean and South Asian origin, and who require more sun exposure to make as much vitamin D. Now, Richard, again, this is another one of the Scottish Government stepping in and offering support for vitamin D supplements. Now, I kind of Neil had a wee giggle there when it said about the sunshine between April and September in Scotland. Yeah, that's a bit questionable, that one. But again, this is another good news story of the Scottish Government stepping in and offering a supplement for people's health and to make sure that they're being healthy, because if you don't get vitamin D, that does affect your bone density.
Absolutely. And I think the beauty of this is that it's a preventative measure. Now, I know that, some of the madder fringes of the Daily Mail will start wailing at this point about the nanny state and personal responsibility and all the rest of it. But frankly, I think the best investment you can make in people's lives after education is in making sure that people enjoy good health without the need for interventions. We spend a very, very high proportion of our government expenditure on the health service, and that's the right thing to do. But I often wonder how much of that spend could be reduced through some fairly simple preventative public health measures, such as, and here's a prime example of that, vitamin D, to help particularly vulnerable groups who are susceptible to deficiencies in vitamin D, particularly given the latitudes that we live at and the lack of sunshine at certain points in the year. But if again, it's one of those very, very small investments that can yield very, very big benefits. And I think taking that more holistic public health-based approach to prevention and harm reduction, I think it has many, many benefits across a whole range of activities. And really, that's where I think we need to start looking at measuring our successes in terms of the outcomes that it gets, rather than always looking at inputs. It's about outcomes and the difference that you're making to people's lives. And I think that this seems to be, with a 40% uptake, which seems to me to be quite high. I think this is something that's clearly been successful, and we need to be looking at more of this in terms of how we can encourage people to do the right sorts of things so that they're living healthy, active lives.
It's all about investing in, the country's well-being, mental health and wellness, and that's what you're wanting to do, because then, that's where your economy comes from. If people are well and healthy, they contribute more to society, and it's about prevention, as you say, Richard. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's just about helping people to live the best lives and the healthiest and happiest lives that they can. And your physical and your mental health are such a huge part of that.
Definitely. Well, that's us for this evening. Thank you very much for joining myself and Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure this evening having Richard here with me. And I would just like to say, if you would like to get involved with Broadcasting Scotland, it is quite easy. As you can see, the details are there on the bottom of the screen. You can get involved. There's various ways. You can volunteer here at the studio. There's lots of voluntary jobs going on, whether it's sitting here in front of the camera or behind the scenes. You can also help us by contributing towards helping us out financially as well. And the other way you can help us out is by sharing and spreading the word of what we do here at Broadcasting Scotland, and trying to bring you stories and news that matters to us here in Scotland. But once again, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.